Hello,
Good
and
morning,
welcome
everyone.
to December.
Welcome to December. Today's class is going to be some talky and then some tie. So there will be some talking, then there will be some tying. A few things we want to cover from the outset is for the folks who are going to be tied, a quick conversation about cool things that you should consider before you are suspended, because you are going to be over the next coming months. In addition to that, I want to talk about the most exciting portion of rope bondage, physics and math when it comes to rope bondage.
The
I know,
sexiest part.
the part that everyone came here for.
Yeah.
Then we're going to have a discussion of partial suspension, and you will have some free time to sort of explore that space. Some announcements. If hopefully folks have noticed, the website for the studio is now live. The first month's offerings from rope jams and classes and parties and everything else are available there.
And guest instructors.
We do have a guest instructor residency for January, and that is Delilah Noddy. Delilah is going to be teaching 2 classes. So please check that out. If you could do us the assist of promoting as much as you can into the spaces and places that you are friends, that would be super helpful. The space itself is looking beautiful, y'all. I can't even tell you how great it is. The rig and the truss is magnificent. The floors came out beautifully. We went and bought a bunch of plants yesterday. It is going to be gorgeous. We can't wait to have you there, and we can't wait to start doing classes. Any other announcements?
Oh, no, I mean, that's really the big one.
Awesome. So let's go into sort of talking about communication and being the person in rope. And in order to do that, I will offer the person who is more often in rope.
Hi. So a couple things that I really want to stress. I know when we started this curriculum, we talked about hey, this is new probably for you being in rope. We're kind of circling back to that time. We're hey, this is probably a new thing again. So one thing I want everyone to keep in mind, but especially the people in rope as you move into being suspended, is that I like to really focus on the fact that even if something that we try in suspension is not successful, it doesn't mean that I failed. It's that it was an experiment, and the experiment maybe wasn't successful. But there's still information to be gleaned by doing it, right? But sort of placing that focus a little bit outward from I didn't do the thing right to that thing didn't go well, right? And what can we learn from that rather than I'm a failure because that didn't succeed.
I would sort of give the example of when I first started doing suspension with Melissa. Melissa did not enjoy it. It was not great.
No, it sucked.
And part of that had to do with my capability and my skill as somebody that was doing the tying, but part of it had to do with both of our understanding of what it meant to be in rope while you were tying.
Yeah. So one thing for me that I didn't understand about being in rope, especially in suspension, is that I am more than half of the people who are going to make this successful. There's only so much that Andrew can do with his tying.
We all know that.
I need to be actively participating and actively communicating both what I'm feeling and how things might change to be more successful. Changes that I need for the rope to happen, where it could be placed on my body, or just whether it's working or not. And also shifting my weight. I very much thought I needed to be a dead weight and just let him move me around. And that was not successful. So I would encourage you to maybe pick up your weight and shift into the ropes and do a lot of things. And as we demo stuff, I'm going to be talking about what I'm doing to participate, because it can look as though I'm not doing anything. And that is far from the truth. So I just want to make sure that's very clear. The expectation that we have, and this might be different for y'all, but I do encourage it, is that I am actively participating in that tie. I'm moving myself, I'm shifting and breathing and and talking to him about what's going on rather than like, you're the top, you're the dom, you do the thing, and I just receive and am here, right? Like, that doesn't work very well. So I do not encourage that as an approach.
And there are places where for the people who are tying, as the person you're tying gives you feedback and they're asking for specific changes or specific outcomes, there are places where your expertise comes into play where you can be like, cool, I can change that, but do you know it's going to change these 2 or 3 things about the structure? And is that a trade-off you want to make? Right. Yes, it is. Cool, I'll make that change.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure that you understand these are the implications of that thing, right?
So, a couple other things, and I kind of touched on this, but like using the fact that you are physically embodied, right? That you can shift and flex and breathe into those ties, and that will probably make them more sustainable for you as the person in the rope. We're gonna touch on this a bit more, but using as much as possible concise and prompt feedback. So trying to like focus the words that you're going to use to be as brief as possible and still communicate what you need and talk about it as quickly as you can, because the faster you can say it, the faster you're gonna get a change that you need. Keep trying, even if it's not successful, try again. Like assess what happened and try again. Because the more you practice, the better you will both get at the things. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the fact that especially in suspension, it can bring up a lot of emotional and psychological things that you may not be prepared for. So give yourself some grace, give yourself some room to process through that. Be willing to say like, hey, this isn't working for me right now. Can we come back to this later? And talk through like what came up. Some of those things may be, one that is most common is disappointment, because the shit doesn't go right all the time. It's just not, that's not how the world works. So giving yourself room for that. But some other things that you may not be expecting can include panic and fear. And those are big ones. And give yourself a lot of space for that. I know I personally have experienced suspensions, particularly face down, where I was having trouble breathing and I started to panic. And that made me super scared. And that took a long time for me to process through. But giving myself the time to like, okay, I need to come down, we need to stop and just like sit and hang out for a bit, and other people kept going and it was fine, but like the entire room stopped. And that's really scary too. Like everyone's focusing on me, right? So just giving yourself the grace to like be okay with those feelings if they come up. It's scary, it's okay. You're gonna live through it. I'm here to attest, right? But making sure that you can communicate what's going on, when it's going on, if possible, right? Trying to process through that stuff. It is scary.
One note that I wanted to make about communication, like as we do the future suspension classes, Melissa's going to be sort of stream of consciousness talking about what she's doing, and how we're working, and will give me feedback. Something to keep in mind is like, our feedback loop is much like learning rope bondage. We have had a dozen years to come to the most concise terms to inform each other of what's going on in rope. So if you're somebody who is in rope and you're like, fuck, I can't process through what I'm feeling and get to that exact level of feedback immediately, this is a practiced skill. Like you are not going to be there immediately. It's not going to automatically happen. If you are that aware of yourself that you can do that, great, that's awesome. You've got a head start. But give yourself some grace in sort of that communication and understand that like, cool, we have been doing this and picking out the words that we use for over a decade, right?
Yeah. Just, using full sentences is awesome. Like if you can process what you're feeling and communicate that right away as a full sentence, awesome. As you get more experience doing it, you may be able to whittle that down to like fewer and fewer words to just really concisely talk about what you're feeling. But just to start being able to say like, I need to come down now. Great. Like, that is a full sentence. That is a thing. That's what you need. And
Or just down.
right.
Down is a sentence.
Right. So like, but also giving yourself the space to say, I need to come down now, right? Like, no questions asked, just down now. Is it?
There's another portion of this communication that I want to talk to for the bottoms, and this is something that I've experienced as somebody who ties, and it's actually fairly frightening for me as someone who ties. There are a lot of people that will go into deep headspace while they are being tied, and some of those people that I have encountered will be so deep into themselves that they aren't necessarily protecting themselves, or they aren't embodied in what their body is feeling. So for the people who are in rope, like, I am not discouraging you from taking your pleasure in the thing that you're doing. Go to those spaces and enjoy those endorphins, but don't go so deep down that rabbit hole that you are no longer connected to your body, right? I've had someone that I tied regularly that I had to be like, cool, I need you to figure out how to do this because I am terrified I am going to hurt you because you are not communicating to me. That is really frightening. So it's something to think about. Question.
So when in those like deep states of like subspace, how comfortable like nonverbal communication? I'm trying to like get to that. Like so like when in like those deep states of subspace, like is there good ways to like non-verbally communicate if a person is
So the question is, when you're in a deep headspace, are there good methods of nonverbal communication? Like, I think those are things that you have to work out between the two of you. Melissa and I have a few nonverbal communication cues that we use when we're tying. There aren't a ton. Melissa is excellent at using her words when we're doing rope. There are a few things that we have that are just, if we're in a place that's loud, or if we're just trying to keep things sort of simple, that we don't talk about. I think what I'm concerned or trying to express a concern about is a deep headspace where you're not even paying attention to that communication. You're not even paying attention to whether or not you
Can communicate or are feeling things that could be harmful for yourself. And then, so if you're not feeling it, then you can't communicate it. Then the person tying you may injure you because you didn't say anything.
For
right?
the example I'll give you, the person that I'm talking about, we literally did an entire scene, got done, untied, I was debriefing, and I was like, how was that? And they were like, well, my arm went numb about 5 minutes in. And I was like, cool, it's important that you tell me that, right? And she was just like, bah, I was in headspace. And I'm like, it's that thing. It is that you are beyond the point of protecting yourself. And be careful with that.
And even when you know for yourself something like that of like, oh, my arm went numb, but I'm okay with it, you still need to communicate it to the other person because they may not, or they might be able to make an adjustment to where it will bring you out of something that can be harmful and can protect you both.
Also,
right?
that's not in my risk profile.
Exactly.
Right? Like that is in some ways a minor transgression of my consent. I've got a question from Don.
Would you describe it as disassociating?
That's something I can speak to.
I am.
Yeah.
So the question is what I described as disassociate. I'm careful I'm careful with the words I choose. I don't, as somebody else who maybe has experienced that thing, I will allow you to use the words that you would use.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. For me, there is a distinction between pain processing space, power exchange, headspace, and disassociation. And also within a scene, there can be cues that will cause me to disassociate rather than get into like one of those more pleasurable headspaces. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I want to be really careful about communicating to a top if I feel that is happening. Mm-hmm. I think like to place all of this in sort of the broader risk profile framework that's been presented across this course. getting very spacey, being nonverbal, these things are not innately bad, but they present a very different risk profile that it is important to allow someone the opportunity to opt into and to actively say, yes, I am comfortable assuming this risk. Yes, I am comfortable piloting this scene for you, and assuming the risk of, if you can't communicate to me that your fingers are getting droppy, for example, but like, I'm shouldering all of that responsibility. So it's about allowing everyone in the scene to enthusiastically say yes to the possible outcomes of the activity that you're going to do together.
There was one more question.
It wasn't a question, but like absolutely, yes, 100%. I'm glad you said that. And also, I just think it's important to point out that these are actually learned skills
Yeah.
Yes.
that people can practice. It's not just like personality.
Right.
No, and
Right.
so the observation was that all of this stuff is a learned skill that can be practiced. That's accurate, and I think that's the point that we're trying to make. All of these things are learned skills, but you won't work on them unless you become aware that they are there and aware that you can work on them. And so that's why we're trying to draw attention to them.
Right. So all of this kind of also can depend on what kind of engagement you are doing, right? Is this a lab time where you are expected to be active and present and giving tons of feedback? Or is it a scene where you are maybe a little less communicative and that's sort of what you've agreed upon, right?
Or
Having those be distinct is helpful so
Or I
that
would
you
say,
each
like-
understand.
I would say, like for Melissa and I, when we do a performance,
Oh, yeah.
unless something is like critical, there's probably very little communication. We are going to be in performance headspace. We have rehearsed something enough and understand sort of what's going to happen and where the trouble spaces will be. And unless something is like danger critical, there's probably not going to be a ton of communication.
Right. So what I would recommend now, this is kind of how do you all work together as a team as you're doing this? Like all of rope is a team exercise, but especially suspension, right? So I highly encourage you to use essentially the scientific method, which is find something that works for you, or if it's not working, as you workshop it, only change one thing at a time and figure out if that thing makes a difference. If it doesn't, then you can change one other thing, right? Just do one at a time rather than like, well, that entire hands behind tie didn't work. Let's throw it all away and try a brand new one. Like, cool, if that works, you don't know why, right? Also using your lab time separate from your play time, right? Don't use your play time to try things for the very first time because you're probably not going to be able to assess and diagnose what didn't go right.
And also, if you're trying something new in your playtime, like you're ascribing a certain amount of emotional or physical interaction or outcome that you want from that thing. This is playtime. I want play as an outcome. And to do something that doesn't work and undercuts that expectation can often make that thing not being optimal like even worse, right? It goes from a place where you can sort of like be like, okay, cool, that didn't work the way we thought it would be, to we had a bad scene. And those are drastically different feelings, right?
Ask for help, right? So like consulting your friends or other people, your cohort mates, us, both for like inspiration or for just like, hey, I'm having trouble with this piece of this thing. Like, do you have suggestions?
We had a question.
Yeah.
Oh, it's more of a comment. This is just making me think about, because I've been having a lot of like people who have never been in rope ask me to tie them now that I have some basic skills. And this is why it's just even more important, like with people who don't know, who have never been in rope, or even if they've been in rope like once or twice, to like how much education as a top we need to provide, or like not jumping into suspension because people can't tell you those things and give you that feedback because they don't actually know. And a lot of like newer bottoms just kind of assume they have to like take it if it's, you know, their hand goes in. They just, they might not think that they like should say that. So it's just like the amount of education that we actually have to do as tops for newer bottoms.
Yep.
So the comment is
Sorry.
that for people who are gaining some skill in rope, they may be asked to tie people more and more often, and that there may be a high degree of education that needs to be done with those people who are newer to rope to make sure that they have a shared understanding of the risks and be able to communicate. And then I think.
And there's a wild, well, I want to make one quick statement about this. There is this wildly good feeling when suddenly a lot of people are like, ooh, you're good at this thing, I want to interact with you. And that's flattering and feels good. And time with new people and seeing the variety of reactions that they have and the variety of experiences you can elicit from them and the amount of enjoyment that you can give to others feels really great, right? And especially for people who don't have a lot of context, the pull of giving them a good experience to start with also feels really great, right? But from a risk standpoint, the more instances in which you're tying with someone with low context, the more often and the level at which you're tying at exponentially starts to grow the potential negative outcomes. And especially if you're tying with a whole lot of different people, and if that's over a whole lot of different geography, especially, when you start having negative outcomes, it becomes really difficult for you as a singular person to help to manage your responsibility for creating those outcomes. So a lot of times that people have been injured historically in sort of rope bondage, that they have felt like they weren't taken care of by the person that they've tied them, it's an outcome of sort of making those choices. So be conscious of that. Question in the back.
It was, again, more of a comment going back to talking about being able to communicate and going through these suspension scenes. Reality is when we're doing these things, these are high stress and trauma to our body that's happening. So I always encourage people to look at what are your responses for stress, high stress and traumatic situations. That can give you clues as to what you may present like and have things that show up on the difficult side, and also your coping, what helps you in those times to allow you to be present, to allow you to be centered, to check in with your body and do those things. And to assess those things before you're in the rope and know those things ahead of time and be able to communicate those ahead of time so that now when we're in the rope, we have a better picture of what that looks like.
Yeah. So to summarize or paraphrase for the stream, the comment had to do with the fact that being in rope and especially in suspension is kind of traumatic. If you have the space to assess what your responses to those kinds of traumatic prompts may look and sound like, and how you can best stay grounded and focused and still able to give feedback in that time before you are experiencing those things. It's a good reflection practice to focus on that ahead of time, if you can. Not everybody is able to sort of abstractly come up with what that looks like for them, so that's okay if that doesn't work for you. I do have some other notes about things to consider as you are going to be going into suspension, how you're going to communicate together as a team. So you will probably need to agree on some sort of direction system you want to use, meaning if I say up and down, but I'm upside down, which direction is that, right? What I do, like some people will use compass directions, some people use left and right, up and down, landmarks in the room. It's up to you.
If you're both medical professionals, you can use dorsal, ventral.
Right. But I would be very
Anterior,
confused,
posterior.
right? So what Andrew and I default to is if I need, I use landmarks on my body instead. So if I need something to move, if I am suspended upright and I need it to move down, I will say, I need you to move that toward my knee or toward my groin. There's no question what direction that is, right?
If
Because-
Melissa's upside down, towards Melissa's waist is entirely dependent on where Melissa's waist is and the rope is.
Right.
And Melissa will say, this rope needs to move towards my waist. I can co-locate where those two things are and make that directional adjustment.
Rather than it needs to move up. Okay, is up toward my waist or is up toward my knee? Because which way is what, right? And if I will say I need something on my left, if he's facing me, that may not be like easily computable for him. So I will usually say like on my left, your right. Like, I will just do that switch for him, so he doesn't have to do that extra step of kind of like mental math.
Again, this is a practiced skill.
Correct, because I realized I would say my left and he would move the thing on his left, and I was like, cool, I need to adjust for that. But that's because that's how we communicate. A way to help determine what thing needs to move is that the person tying can touch the places that they think you are talking about. Like, hey, I might say, something is wrong on my right arm, but I don't know which wrap it is. And he could touch the things on my right arm to help me locate. Like, is it the top wrap that I'm touching now, or is it the bottom wrap that I'm touching here? And that can help me pinpoint, because especially for me, the wraps are very close together. It can be hard for me to tell sometimes, especially when, to Ash's point, I'm in kind of a trauma response mode. So it can just be helpful for that kind of stuff. Also giving feedback in a sort of non-judgmental way can be really helpful. So we're not here to hurt each other's feelings. We might be here to hurt each other, because that part's fun, but not hurting each other's feelings. So
Depends on how sexy you do it.
right, but hearing something like, you always do this, or, you know, you tied it too tight, rather than like, this is tight, right? Could we do it looser? You want to comment on the tie and not the person so much, like,
This pattern is trash, not you are trash.
you are trash and you always tie like trash, like, whoa, right? And even if, as much as possible, if you do get a response like that, trying not to like feed back into it, like, well, you always tell me I'm wrong, right? Like, I hear you that this is too tight, I will try to tie looser going forward, like, rather than, you know, why is your feedback always so negative?
You tie like trash. This is all you deserve.
Yeah.
Like that's not helpful.
You're a garbage bottom, like,
Yeah.
no, come on.
Trash.
right?
Garbage gets tied like trash. That's what you expect.
Yeah.
Like these are not good feedback loops.
Don't do it. Yeah. Speaking of feedback, setting up a cadence for your post-scene feedback or your post-lab feedback can be really helpful. So debriefing of what worked and what didn't work after, at some point, like, you might do it immediately, but then also give yourself some time to reflect and like re-embody, because you may notice that stuff isn't quite right like within a day or so. I know recently I tied with a friend of ours who was visiting, and the next day I realized that I had some numbness in an area that I hadn't realized immediately after, so I had to let her know like the next day that something wasn't right. I do highly recommend, and this is a practice again that Andrew and I have, which is talking about, at least in the like immediate aftermath, like what was the worst thing, and then this is important, the order, the worst thing and then the best thing, right? Because by knowing that you're gonna move from the worst thing to the best thing, it allows you to encapsulate and like time box that worst part, so you're not dwelling on it. And you can move into like, yeah, there was this thing that really sucked, but you know what was great. And that's the thing you kind of leave that space with, is like, that was tough, we can work on that. The thing that was great is what we're gonna focus on and like keep a good feeling about, to make it worthwhile to come back and revisit and try again. Some more things to think about. Being aware of your space and the orientation of where the feedback will be coming from. If it's loud, if the person's head is not near the other person's head, like if I'm inverted and Andrew's head is way up there, my head is way down here, he's not going to hear me when I try to give him feedback. So he needs to be more conscious about bringing his ears close to my mouth, right? Otherwise, he's not going to be able to actually effectively check in with me. I may not be able to tell him what's going on. There are other ways I could try to get his attention, but even those may not be successful, right? I could snap my fingers, they're closer to his ears. But if I can't
hear you.
And if I can't move my hands, and that's what I'm trying to tell him, snapping is not going to work, right? So like, making sure that when you're working, you know where the feedback's going to be coming from is really important, and talk about that in advance. Like, hey, when I go inverted, be sure you come down and check on me. Again, prepping for trying to use as few words as possible to communicate what you need. Work on giving positive feedback as well as the things that aren't working successfully. Some examples might be like, this tie feels really balanced, or I could be in this for a while. Like not just the negatives, not just the changes that are needed, but like, hey, this is working great. I'm having a good time. Like, this is fun, right? Why, like, sort of reminders to both of you of like, why are you doing this? For the tops, trying to ask actionable, relevant questions. Like, do you need me to adjust any of your wraps right now? Instead of, is this uncomfortable? Or are you okay?
And I'm gonna give an even more specific bit to the tops. Once you have established that the person you are tying will communicate with you, shut up. Just tie and trust that person to tell you when something needs to be changed. As opposed to every 5 seconds going, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this all right? Is this okay? Is this all right? Is this okay? You are not giving that person time to process the thing that they are feeling. You are also not giving them time to enjoy the thing that you are doing, because they are constantly being interrogated about the experience that they are having. It is not an interrogation scene, it is a rope scene, right? So once you understand that this person will communicate with me, I can trust them to communicate with me, and that's a thing that might take some time to build. But once you have that trust, shut up.
But also not just, is it okay? Are you okay? Like, do you need me to change anything? Is your left hand all right? I see you moving it. Like, asking actionable questions, waiting for a response because they may need a minute to process, and then moving forward without asking more questions at that time. So yeah, giving them a moment to come up with an answer. Bottoms, giving specific and actionable feedback. That can sometimes be, my hand is tingling and I'm not sure why, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you know the answer to, of like, I need this changed, but just making sure that you're communicating what's going on in your body to the person tying you. They may have like, oh, I can see something that I can try to fix that. Or just like, cool, I'll keep that in my mind so that maybe we transition out of that thing that's putting pressure there and we can move on, and then it will remove that risk. Even if you don't think it's a problem, you just should still communicate it, because it can become a problem. Or it may be out of their risk profile. So it's important that they know what's going on. If you tie with the same person, so again, this is for the bottoms, if you're tying with the same person, you may start to learn their timing of like, you know how long it takes them to attach that upline, so you can wait until they're done to then give a feedback, right? If it's not urgent. And that way you can sort of know also how long you might have left in that next thing. Like, oh, I know they're gonna go switch this thing next, so I don't need to give them this feedback because we're gonna move out of it now. But you can also frame things as urgent or not urgent. Hey, this thing is happening, it's not urgent that we address it right now, but maybe it can be the next thing you do, right? And I will often do that. It will help him especially prioritize when to get to something. Like, not urgent, can you adjust the cuff on my ankle? For the tops, please acknowledge that you heard the feedback. And maybe let the person know how soon you can address it if it's something that needs to be addressed. Like, cool, yes, that will be the next thing I do. We'll probably get to it within 30 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever. Like, cool, you're coming down, you'll be down in 30 seconds, right? That can make things much more sustainable for the person in the rope to know a specific time frame. Even if it's not totally accurate, it's just good to have some kind of time box when you don't know that timing, it can feel like an eternity. Right?
One thing.
Huh?
This
Yep.
is from a bottom's perspective. I really don't like when tops try to like make excuses for it or explain. I think they're doing their own processing about like why something went wrong, but that's like not the time to do it.
Right.
And I've had tops be like, oh, well, that's not feeling right because of this. And I'm like, that's not helpful right now.
Right.
So yeah, don't try to like explain away like what went wrong, just fix it. And then when you're debriefing, you can like have
Yeah,
that conversation.
so the comment was, sometimes tops, when they get feedback, will start to try to explain why the thing is happening. Save that for after the scene. In the moment, that's not helpful, it doesn't fix it. So keep that for later, file that away, and talk about it after you have finished tying or changing whatever needs to be fixed. That is most of what I have. The two final quick things are, if you are in a DS or MS partnership, if it helps to give yourselves permission to give constructive criticism, like from the bottom side, think of it as service. Or if the D type needs to explicitly say, like, this is a service you are doing for me, or I give you the command to give me feedback, do that thing, please. And finally, for the bottoms, you are your own best advocate. The person in the rope does not know what you are feeling. They cannot know how your body is
The person
reacting.
tying the rope, you mean.
Yes.
You
If
said the
I'm-
person in the rope.
I misspoke. The person tying doesn't know what you feel as the person in the rope. You in the rope need to speak up. They can't fix it if they don't know it's wrong. They can't know what you're feeling or what emotions are coming up, so please be your own advocate.
And as sexy as it might sound, the person tying you cannot read your mind.
I think it would be the worst thing in the world, personally.
I mean, for me, yes.
But I know. I don't want you to know what I'm thinking all the time. Yeah, no, I don't think you would want, you have enough thoughts in that pretty little head. So yeah, that's what I got for y'all. It is a team project. Please approach it together. Have fun, go forth, be free, but also practice. It's all a practice. Both sides is a practice. You'll get better at it.
Any questions before we move on to the next topic?
It may suck, but keep going.
It's not a question, but I like recently realized that it's also okay to ask for like emotional needs.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
if I'm in a suspension and I'm panicking, it's okay to say like, I need a reassuring touch.
Yeah.
Or like, can you just take a second and like come down so I can see your face?
Yeah.
And that's helpful a lot.
So the statement was these aren't only physical acts that are oftentimes needed, but often they are emotional things, and those things can be asked for as well.
Yeah, so things like, I need to see your face, I need you to connect with me, just with like a reassuring touch.
I need
or
you
a
to talk to me.
phrase. Yeah, and yes, absolutely, those are valid and helpful, and for those of you who are learning to suspend, I caution you because you will get very caught up in, I have to do all this order of operations, and you will probably forget to check in with that person in a like connective, grounded way. Take a minute. For the people in the rope, be sure to ask for that if that's what you're needing in that moment. It's intense for both of y'all. Yes.
I have a quick comment before we move on.
Mhm.
This is something that you've heard from us in the past, and is a thing that you will continue to hear from us. For the people in this room who are tying, part of why you are listening to this conversation of what it is like to bottom for suspension is that the person that you are tying has opted into trusting you with their physical and emotional safety to further your education. And I think that bears repeating, because that's a pretty big deal and it's pretty cool. And they are ultimately going to be an incredible resource for you, especially moving into these like high risk, high difficulty exercises. And also like, hey, maybe take a second to say thank you.
And you're both learning together,
Yeah.
and it's gonna be hard for both of you.
So let's move on from that emotional cuddliness and recognition of our humanity to the implacable coldness of science. All right. So a lot of people like to argue a lot about the math and the science of rope bondage and physics. I tend to care about the portion that is applicable, and completely eschew arguing about other stuff. I find it more beneficial for me to spend my time tying than arguing about math. But there are some math concepts that I would like you to understand. And we're going to do this in the course of a Q&A. So, if I have one weighted piece, let's call it a body, and I've got two carabiners that are hanging parallel. No, let's not do that. Last time we did that, one of the water bottles exploded and everything got wet. Or for example, if this were a piece of bamboo, and I had two distinctly separate lines that were hanging parallel to each other, attached to one piece of weight. Can anybody guess how that weight would be distributed between these two carabiners if they were perfectly perpendicular like this? Louder than that.
Evenly distributed?
They're evenly distributed. 50% of the weight goes in each, right? Does that make sense? This is part of the appeal of why people like bamboo, is because you can distribute weight evenly as long as those lines are apart from each other. Now,
When it's horizontal, right? They're
I'm gonna get there. We are going to be working with single points, and we're going to be working a lot with triangles. So let's talk about the physics and the force of triangles. And triangles are applicable in a lot of directions, and we'll sort of talk about the directionality of those. But the thing about the triangle is the farther you bring these things apart, if they are attached to the same weight, the weight itself and the force it's exerting gets heavier. Does that make sense? So at a 90-degree angle, you're supporting about 150% of the weight. And that expands and expands and expands. I think it's at 120 degrees, you're over 3 times the initial weight. So all of this, if you're putting it on a singular body, now imagine a person here, it wants to do this. It wants to crush them down
It's always trying to get back to that center.
and bring them to
line.
center parallel. It wants to bring them plumb, right? And the shorter these lines are, so the distance between here and my suspension point, so if I went up to my suspension point and I took all of this space out, right? I'm gonna do a quick knot here. These lines become shorter.
This is just for demo purposes, never do that in your suspension.
When these lines become shorter, it takes a shorter distance between these two to increase that angle, right? So if I'm down here and I'm pulling that far apart, if you're counting this as a line, measuring this line, I can pull it way farther and not increase this angle as much. If these lines are shorter and I pull them the same distance, holy shit, that angle got really big really quickly, right? This has implications for the distance between where you set your hard point to the body of the person that you are tying and the rope that is between. Does this make sense?
Can you repeat that one more time, please?
Okay, so I will give you an example. So I'm going to say, let's see, about a forearm's distance, right? And that angle is a little shy of 90 degrees. If I untie this and make this longer, and I open the same forearm's distance,
That's further.
that is nowhere near 90 degrees. It's way shorter, right? So there's way less force pushing this in. So the longer these uplines are, the less likely you are to make a very wide angle, meaning less force is being distributed onto the body that's sustaining that angle.
So
Does
the-
that help
Yes.
more?
Basically,
Yes.
the further you have for the person you're suspending to your hard point, the less compressive force you're adding to them. Does that work for?
As with everything, there are trade-offs. You can make this point super high, but can you reach it? Right? So you have to value the trade-off between what can I reach and how can I interact with that point, and what is the distance and how much force I'm exerting on bodies. These triangles flip upside down. So if you're thinking of the base of this triangle like someone's body in between it, you could also think of the base of this triangle as the front wraps of any sort of body harness, right? So as you pull away from the body, because you're attached to that line, you're creating an angle. The more open that angle is, the more force you're exerting on either side of their rib cage or arms or leg or whatever is attached, right? The deflection point is dictating the force that's pressing in on the portions of the body.
So there's a reason we asked you to tie that top wrap of your chest harness pretty tight, because we don't want it deflecting away from the body very much. Because the more you deflect, the stronger that angle is, the more you're crushing in on the person's torso.
I'm going to correct the thing that you just said
Oh.
by saying it's the exact opposite.
Whoops.
The reason that we're looking for you to tie that firmly is that the more you deflect, the looser that thing becomes, the more likely it is to move. But if it doesn't deflect at all, you're really crushing the body in, because that's a very wide angle, right? So in some ways, you're looking for the middle ground between I want this to come away from the body enough that it isn't unpleasant for the person that's being tying, or unsustainably unpleasant, versus it comes too far away from the body and I'm worried about those lines moving. Does that as a concept make sense? Heather?
So when you're looking at a harness, actually, this is really interesting. So when you're looking at a harness, like how far are you generally wanting it to deflect?
Depends on the person I'm tying, depends on the size of their body, depends on the length across their back or their torso or the thing that I am tying.
This might be a longer conversation, but can you talk a little bit about those factors and what you're looking for within that?
What I am looking for and understanding is balancing the capability of, so this is where it gets messy and less science. What is the person experiencing versus what am I observing? If they are like, this is too tight and this sucks and I cannot sustain this, versus, oh my gosh, that thing is moving, or it is twisting, or it is shearing, or it is doing any of those things, like those types of things can sometimes be solved by tension, or they can be solved by more frictions.
So it sounds like you want it to be like loosed up until the point where it might shift, shear, cause a problem on the body. But it sounds like looser to that point is actually more comfortable.
It entirely depends on the person being tied.
Yeah, so this is part of why, for example, Melissa and I have very different preferences about the relative tightness of the top wrap when Andrew is tying it on us. My tolerance and or enjoyment of shitty squanchiness is very high. And so that is a sensation that I will actively seek out and influences how tight I want that top wrap. For someone who does not want that shitty squanchy, like, oh no, my shoulder's feeling, they're generally going to want that top wrap looser, which introduces other safety concerns, right? I am opting into potentially a higher degree of risk in terms of nerve impingement while it is being tied while we're waiting to go up, whereas a looser top wrap is opting into more sort of concerns around, is this going to shift? Is it going to deform? What's going to happen when we load it?
And I'm not telling you this because there is an answer. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the variables. And this isn't a thing that people talk a lot about. So they'll sort of talk about the idea and the physics of these angles, and they'll have an understanding of them because they've been well explored scientifically in the climbing community and in the professional rigging community. But they don't necessarily talk about, why do I make that choice? What are the implicit trade-offs that I'm making? If I'm doing this, am I doing it for a purpose? So one of the things that I will tell you, like, about wide angles, going back to like bamboo tying, is you'll oftentimes see people tie people in multiple verticals, and then they'll take a rope and pull those verticals together. When they're pulling those verticals together, they're taking the tension that already exists on the body and then increasing it by smashing it together.
Forcing it all together.
So
right?
somebody like Akira Naka will build a very intense tie that is vertical lines and then ramp up that intention by pulling all of those lines together and creating more of a crushing force on the person that they're tying on purpose. They'll choose to do that, right? And so I'm making this explicit so you can start to think about these things and start to actively make those choices as opposed to not thinking about them. The second thing that I want to explain with this is in deference to where you start with a body in suspension. So if I am suspending somebody in an upright, or actually any tie, side suspension, whatever else, and their body isn't plumb directly underneath the point, I want a reason for that to happen. Because if they're out here, when I start tying them and I attach them, and I pull them to go up in the air, they're going to come to here. And suddenly their distance, at here, there is this distance from the floor.
There's further, right?
At here, they are much closer to the floor.
Suddenly, instead of 16 inches away, now they're 12 inches away, and that's a very stark change when you are the person in the rope. That change of 4 inches is a massive change.
And the
to
less,
to the person experiencing it.
and this might be like less of an impact to like, it is very rare that you're going to make that change and someone is going to hit the floor. But what I will tell you is you'll make that change and suddenly the height of their body in a side suspension, now suddenly they're this much lower, right? And suddenly they're a lot more horizontal instead of in a V. And that has implications for what you're doing from a time standpoint. And I very rarely hear people talk about, when they talk about suspension, where are you placing a person in deference to where you want them to land, right? So I might place someone behind this point because I know that when I tie them, so Melissa might be kneeling.
Yeah, if I'm kneeling to start, I might start over here, like
But I
away,
might have
because then
Melissa
I know
here.
I'm gonna shift and
Yeah.
be directly under the point.
Or I
Because
might have
know
Melissa
I'm gonna
here.
have that much space, right?
And then I know I want her to be up. Oh, wait, now she is directly plumb underneath the line, right? As opposed to if she scoots up and is kneeling,
Now
and I
I'm
start
way
here.
over here.
Now all of a sudden she's here.
And then when I get attached, I'm gonna be back over here, and that's a weird transition moment for me, right? This is a lot to keep in mind, so don't feel like you have to keep all of this in your head all at once right now. But
But
just
keep it all in your head at once right now.
start to think about where are you starting, right? As we are tying, you may be inclined to not stand directly under the point, because for those of you who are taller, you may hit your head on the point that you set for yourself because you want it to be the right height where you can reach and work. So start with tying the person away and then reposition them under, right? That's fine. You can move around, especially if you're standing up. What do you got?
Huh, just got stuff in your butt.
Fuzz on my butt.
So-
But yeah, it's something to keep in mind, especially when we get to the upright. Often, when I'm in the upright that we're gonna do, I drop by like 4 inches, and that's just something we have to account for.
But if Melissa's significantly in front or significantly behind,
It's gonna be even
she's
more.
going to drop way more than 4 inches, right? So the general thing I want you to take away from this talk is these two carabiners always want to be together. If they are over here, they always want to be underneath this point, right? These always want to come to directly underneath your suspension point. So whether it is in making triangles or V's, or whether it is when you're tying and attaching someone to the rope, these always want to end up here very badly.
Gravity is a bitch.
And it is
will
not a
always get you back to right there.
and is not a thing you can argue with.
No.
If you have specific questions as you start to go through this, feel free to ask, but I want you to start considering these implications. Questions
All
about that
makes
stuff?
sense. Yeah.
So I failed AP physics. And when you started talking about the application to the harness, that's where I got lost.
Okay, so
Would it be easier to do a demo?
sure, we've got to do partial suspension demonstration anyway, so I can tie something on you and we can talk about it while we do our partial suspension demonstration. How about that? So I'm going to tie and I'm going to talk a little bit. What did you do with this?
It came like that.
Nothing. All right. I'm going to do a little partial demonstration. And I'm going to talk about what I like about partials, and then the rest of the class is going to be your opportunity to experiment. I will tell you generally, when I am tying for pleasure, 70% of the ties I do are partial suspensions. Usually, if you see me out somewhere and we are doing a full suspension, it will be a conversation that goes like this. Andrew says, Melissa or Nora, what kind of rope do you want?
I don't
Melissa-
know, some show-offy bullshit.
Melissa or Nora will say exactly, I want to do some show-offy bullshit. And that means
Full suspension.
we're gonna do a full suspension. Otherwise, we are likely going to do something that is a partial.
The reason for that is
I'm gonna talk about that while I tie you,
that
so we have more time.
it's more fun.
I don't think that the answer is that it's, what are you doing to my, I will manage my own rope. Please stop. I can find my own rope, thank you. So, I'm gonna start off by not having Melissa here. That's even farther away from the suspension point than I want you. That's even farther, let's go right underneath. So not only do I wanna look at Melissa being right underneath, I want her to scoot up a little bit, so the back of Melissa's back is right underneath. Right? And I'm going to talk about why in a second. So, what I like about suspensions is that they create enough balance for me to manipulate someone's body easily.
Partial
Because-
suspension.
Partial suspensions.
Partial suspension.
Because I am lazy. But it gives me all of the three-dimensional opportunities of a full suspension in not having that friction with the ground and being able to move parts of bodies around.
So what that means is if I'm fully, all my weight is on the ground, he has to move all of my weight with the friction of the floor, right? That's kind of a lot, and the bigger the person. So if I'm trying to manipulate Andrew, my ability to move him fully on the ground is challenging. If I take some of that weight away by attaching it to an upline, suddenly I have a lot more freedom because I can manipulate his body more easily. That said, it limits the capability of what types of movement I can do because part of him is attached to a dead grass to a ceiling, right? So you have trade-offs, but one of those really powerful trade-offs is the fact that then the body becomes lighter in weight and so more easy to manipulate. And especially if you get someone onto, like, maybe say up on a knee, then you have a pivot point, which can make things a lot more dynamic and a lot easier to manipulate. So I will let him demonstrate in just a minute.
Yeah. So I'm going to start off with a hands behind tie that we all know. Please go
I didn't do anything.
with my ropes ever again. And I'm just going to use a body harness and a bunch of single column ties. So there's nothing technically complex about what I'm doing. You don't need to know any more than one harness.
And you do not, for your explorations, you do not need to use this harness
You can use any harness you want.
or just single columns. It's
Yeah.
up to you. Like, this is gonna be your sort of play and experiment time. We are demoing this because we're gonna show you about deflection and harnesses and whatnot.
Hello. I'm going to do a little nurturing here.
Is this connected?
Because I did a little minor yelling about the nature of my rope. So I'm gonna do a little connection. You know, connection.
Have you tried sniffing, Melissa?
I can't sniff with this mask on.
Good. I believe
What
in
is
you.
that a thing? I'm a big fan of sniffing. Yeah.
Uh,
It's not sniffing.
Pheromones, yeah. I don't think they.
It's not actively sniffing. It is that it is what happens when you're tying,
And you get
especially
out
if
of
you're
breath.
tying from behind, is that it's a million times easier to do this.
Yeah.
And this looks like-
a real sniff.
There is a trope of what we sort of traditionally refer to as the rigor sniff.
Yeah.
This comes from a point in time when it was believed, some folks still believe, that you can mechanize a feeling of connection or the emotional response that your bottom is having. And a part of that formula was leaning in and sniffing your bottom like pretty loudly and invasively. So when we joke about rigor sniff, we are using that as a shorthand to reference this
Creepy,
sort of
weird.
formulaic approach
Yeah.
to engaging with the person in your room.
I can cause you to have an emotion.
experienced that, like, with multiple people, multiple times,
So-
and I always ask, what are you?
So I would offer that there may be multiple things going on there. One is, as you are tying, the person tying may have gotten out of breath or maybe in a state of excitement, and they're taking that moment to kind of catch their breath. Another option may be that you smell nice and they're trying to get a nice smell of you. Another option may be, and this is something that actually can be helpful, is if the front of their chest is to the back of your torso, there is a moment there where you can connect and like synchronize your breathing, and that may be what they're trying to do. I cannot speak for all of the people that you have encountered this with, but there are multiple times and spaces where that can be fun and helpful and useful and a thing you might enjoy. That
Alright.
said, it's weird and creepy sometimes.
So, if I can refocus this for a second, please.
Back to partial suspensions.
So, I've attached Melissa. Melissa is sort of plumb underneath this point. I'm going to increase Melissa's experience of the tension of this position by doing this.
Hey,
Her body got farther away from the point, so the deflection on the back of this tie got higher. Does
There's
that make
also
sense?
just the amount of the distance of the harness to the point itself has shifted, right? I'm like several inches lower, so there just is more gravity working on me now.
Also, Melissa is off center, so there's a pull that is holding her body in this direction, right? So I have essentially changed her experience just by having her move from that kneeling position to the sitting position. Does that make sense?
Is everybody clear what Andrew means when he says deflection?
No.
That's a good question.
So when Andrew is
All right,
describing-
turn around, please.
Yeah.
Watch the top wrap.
So notice the angle of the wrap itself, right?
Watch this wrap.
It's fairly straight across right now. Does everyone agree with that?
Yes.
Cool. What angle is it now?
It deflected. It changed from its original positioning due to the forces that were applied to it.
Right? So that rope, the fact that this knot is now further away from the point means that that wrap has to come up, means that there's now a triangle there. Yeah? Cool.
So now I'm going to
Now we do partial.
something that I like about partials. Please don't do that. Is that I can exert forces that Melissa would not be able to sustain were we in a full suspension. So rather than tying this loosely in a way that might need to be tied were we fully suspending, I can tie it tighter to keep it from moving. Carabiner in. Raise to here. All right. So we were talking about triangles earlier and talking about bringing ropes together. I can either lock off here or here, and then, oh, sorry, right? Crunch. And crunch. Right?
Tighter.
This is for my enjoyment, not yours.
That was the start of the sentence, my bad.
Uh-huh. But now you can see the deflection change here, right? So I'm not just pulling straight up, I'm pulling to the side. That's what I mean by deflection. Right? But I can also in a partial suspension. Rotate Melissa into more of a face down position. And now you see, this was the triangle I was talking about. So if this was this point, this triangle is exerting force here and here, trying to push those two together. The farther this gets away from the bottom, the less force it's exerting. The closer it is to the back, the more force it's exerting. The farther it gets away from the bottom, the more likely it is to slip. The closer it is to the bottom, the less likely it is to slip. Does that make sense? And then I can take this rope back out.
And notice how, because I'm on this pivot point of my knee, he can rotate me around really easily, right? If that whole side of my thigh were on the ground, it would be a lot harder.
Right? And then just clutch foot in. And this is just two lines. This is a single column, and then whatever I've attached to this thing, right? And then I can get kicked a little by Melissa. You can go back to this part, because I like having fun. And I can lower this down.
That didn't do anything.
So one of the bits that I like about this, oh no, is that I can move in and out of things in ways that I might not be able to in suspension. So I can lower, and now Melissa's just on that hip.
I'm not on anything.
Or it's just on this.
I'm not on anything.
You aren't on anything.
What's happening?
What is happening?
What do you mean you're not on anything?
Oh,
Melissa's on this line,
he didn't really lower
but it's
anything.
being caught between these two.
You didn't lower my chest, though.
And I can take this extra rope, and I can use it for something else.
But I'm not lower.
You aren't lower. Did you want to be lower?
I thought I was going lower.
You thought you were. Right? And then Melissa starts making adorable sounds like the one she's making now, which I find amusing, even if she doesn't.
My hand is getting tingly.
Okay.
No, it's fine.
Right? And I can just riff on these two ropes for a very long time.
And don't let anyone tell you partials are easier. Oh, fuck.
Right? I can riff on these two ropes for a very long time and have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And Melissa can have a lot of misery.
Can you move my knee closer to my chin?
This knee?
My bottom knee. Thank you.
There you go.
Oh,
Look at that. I can lower that way.
wow.
So, for me, I can stay close to Melissa. I can create a whole lot of different positions. I have a whole lot of freedom to improvise. I can do things that Melissa would normally not put up with in a full suspension.
Like a thigh cuff of only 2 wraps and that tight on my thigh, it would be
Melissa would murder me if I did that. in full
probably
suspension.
unbearable in full suspension for me.
I can start to recontextualize. Ropes in ways that they didn't go on as intended.
Yeah. So I think what he maybe, if I can paraphrase for you, if we add something in suspension, often it will need to go on and come off sort of in the same sequence. In partials, because you can like drop someone back down to the floor and then take them back up, you can play around with that order a lot more freely than you would in a full suspension.
This is why this is fun for me from a scene standpoint, right? I feel like I get a lot more play. Like I can be playful and artistic and original and create sensations a lot more effectively.
And
Now
for the person in the rope, sometimes being in a partial can be slightly easier, or you can asked to come back down more quickly and more easily than you would from a full suspension, which can allow you like a rest, pause, and then you can go back up into a partial or like in a different way, a different approach, more easily than from a full suspension.
And that doesn't mean that you can't do all of this stuff in a full suspension.
Right.
What it means is, I can do this stuff in a partial suspension, right? The limitations aren't suspension, the limitations are me.
And,
Right.
and also like, you can both be on the floor together, which is generally a little easier on both of you. It allows a little more playfulness, potentially some more creativity, some more improvisation in a way that you may not find as easily accessible in full suspension. The clock may not be running quite as strongly or like urgently in a partial. That said, I will reiterate what I said while I was in it, which is don't let anyone tell you partials are easier from a bottoming standpoint.
I can still create intense sensations without having something to do.
So intense. And psychologically, it can be more intense because you're like, but the floor's right fucking there. Why is this so hard? Right?
So given all of that stuff, you have the next 50 minutes, 5-0, to play around with partial suspension. If you have questions, ask us. That is what we're here for.
Yeah. If you need to take a break, please do that, right? Like, we talked to you for a long time. If you need the bathroom or outside to go do that thing.
Is there any need for a break?
Nope. You can